what Biden is doing with respect to Israel is disgraceful. If any Jewish person voted for Joe Biden, they should be ashamed of themselves.
Former President Trump is quick to slam President Biden after a dramatic turn in the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. Biden warning that the U.S. will not send defensive weapons to Israel if the Netanyahu government goes ahead with a full-scale invasion into Rafah. The president's decision follows months of growing tension between the two allies, and as he faces pressure at home to take a harder line. Joining me now is The Hill's national politics reporter, Julia Manchester. Julia, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Margaret.
President Biden's warning to Israel came during an interview with CNN, and we just heard senators speak out against the comments.
The consequences of this decision, Mr. President, are going to change the region and the world for all the worse.
What's happening with the Biden administration today is not only does it force people to question our reliability as an ally, it puts Israel's national security interests at risk.
The president is only emboldening Hamas.
If the commander-in-chief can't muster the political courage to stand up to the radicals on his left flank and stand up for an ally at war, the consequences will be grave.
Julia, talk about the significance of Biden's warning. Are there any risks here for the administration in taking this kind of hard stand?
Yeah, well, Margaret, this is certainly a major move by the Biden administration, or I should say a major warning. We know that even though the Biden administration has been critical of Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu since October 7th, especially since Israel has been bombarding civilians in Gaza, we've seen the U.S. still continue to support arms shipments and send arms shipments to Israel. So this warning definitely marks a turn in Biden's strategy towards Israel. In terms of the risk, look, I think it risks potentially more division within the Democratic Party. We know that there are a lot of pro-Israel Democrats, but at the same time, it's hard to look at this and not see the domestic political implications. We know that progressives and Arab American voters in major states like Michigan and also even Minnesota have essentially said they would sit out the election if Biden were to continue to partner with Israel and take this hard line stance in the war. So this is a major turning point, and I think also historic in its nature, because we know that the U.S. traditionally has been one of Israel's most vocal and ardent allies.
Critics of Biden's approach to the war are keeping up the pressure on this president. This includes a group of nearly 700 Jewish college professors who signed a letter to Biden urging him not to back the AntiSemitism Awareness Act. What is their main concern, and is there a sense Biden won't sign this bill?
Well, I think there's a few things at question here. First of all, we've seen critics, raise concern about, the scope of this legislation, what it could mean for speech going forward. And we know that anti-Semitism, as well as other forms of prejudice, there's always this debate about speech and what constitutes hate speech and such. There's also concerns in the community, I think in the Jewish community, about Biden's stance on Israel itself. So he's definitely been walking this fine line in terms of how to approach this.
Back to that CNN interview, Biden was pressed on his handling of the economy. He rejected the current polling on his ability to tame inflation, saying instead that the economy has turned around and voters just don't realize it. Is the president out of touch with how Americans feel about their finances?
Well, voters don't like being told they're wrong, especially when they're feeling prices continue to be high and inflation not tick down. So this sort of goes in line with Biden's messaging that we've heard earlier this year and last year that, the administration is doing what it can to fuel the economy, that it's going to take some time. But look, the Biden administration is grappling with how to get a message on the economy, because right now this is a major weak spot for him. Earlier this month, we saw those jobs numbers come out. We know that the Biden administration has been huge in touting job growth under it, but the job growth even slowed down in the U.S. So I think there's real concern about how to message on this, and, suggesting that voters are wrong could end up backfiring.
Turning to news out of Congress, the House united Wednesday to kill Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene's attempt to remove Speaker Johnson.
I want to say that I appreciate the show of confidence from my colleagues to defeat this misguided effort. That is certainly what it was. In this moment, the country desperately needs a functioning Congress. And that's what the overwhelming majority of the members in this body demonstrated today.
While the vote ends Greene's attempts for now, it does show that Republicans seem to be growing tired of all the political infighting. What did she really win out of this effort to try and oust Johnson?
Well, look, we're continuing to talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene, so it could be seen as some sort of branding move or branding exercise. She probably earned some points with some donors, so this could be seen as a fundraising exercise. But I would say that Johnson isn't necessarily out of the woods yet. Remember, Democrats said they would team up with Republicans this time to save Johnson in the case that the motion to vacate was brought to the floor, and we saw them do that. However, Democrats have not committed to saving him down the line. And we do know that while the majority of Republicans sided with Johnson on this, and this motion to vacate really failed spectacularly, there still is Republican frustration that in Johnson's negotiations with Democrats, particularly on that national security supplemental, that we're giving too much aid to Ukraine and not enough funding towards the southern border. We know that immigration and securing the border is a big deal for Republicans. So there's still some frustration there. So Johnson still has to work on towing that line.
Now to the other chamber, where senators are rushing to get an FAA reauthorization bill done. Senator Ted Cruz, the GOP floor manager for the bill, is receiving some flack for his work on bringing both parties together on this legislation. Julia, he's always been known as a firebrand. So what type of reaction to Cruz are you hearing on the Hill?
Yeah, well, my colleague Al Weaver reported on this for The Hill, and, essentially it is all in jest, really. It's just Republican senators, even some Democrats, pointing out the irony in Cruz really trying to fast track this FAA authorization bill and, sort of saying no to any additional amendments. I think Cruz in the past has slowed walked some legislation, has proven to very much been a block against some progress on the Hill. So, he's taking it, I think, in a good natured way as well. But, this could politically benefit Cruz. Remember, part of this bill would include a direct flight from Ronald Reagan or DCA National Airport here in Washington to San Antonio, Texas. Cruz pointing out that there's a large military and veteran population, easier access to the Pentagon that way. And we know that Cruz is facing a re-election bid against Colin Allred that is favored to, he's favored to win in, but at the same time, this is something he can additionally bring to the campaign trail.
Senators certainly seem to take on an interesting position in election years. And news we can't overlook today, Stormy Daniels has retaken the stand in Donald Trump's hush money case. Her testimony will likely wrap up soon. What's next in this trial, and are there other key players we're waiting to hear from?
Yeah, so I think the next key player we're waiting to hear from is former President Trump's bookkeeper. Now, Stormy Daniels' testimony might have been salacious and dramatic and really gotten a lot of our attention, but the bookkeeper is really interesting because we know that hush money payments and appointments and those meetings are all at the center of this case. So the bookkeeper might have more insight on that. And then, of course, we have Michael Cohen, Trump's former fixer who really set up this hush money payment. We are waiting for him to testify as well.
While the former president is on trial in New York, an interesting development involving the youngest Trump out of Florida. Barron Trump has been selected by the Florida GOP as a delegate at the Republican National Convention. Not usually one to make headlines. Can we expect to see more of Barron in the political spotlight?
It's possible. Look, he's still young. He needs to graduate high school. He's, going to be 18 if he's not 18 already. But, this definitely is a shift. We know that when Barron Trump was 9 years old or 10 years old, when his father, first ran for president, he was obviously in the spotlight with his parents. But in general, he, was not taking on a vocal role the same way his older siblings were. So this is certainly interesting to see him. He'll go to the convention, play a role in this. So we'll see. Maybe he'll play a bigger role on the campaign trail. We'll just have to see.
The Hill's Julia Manchester. Julia, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
The two parties have selected their presidential candidates, but primary season is still underway. Nebraska, West Virginia, and Maryland all hold their primaries on Tuesday. But it's Maryland's Senate race that might pose a threat to Democrats' majority in the upper chamber. To break down the numbers, we're bringing in the senior director of Emerson College Polling, Matt Taglia. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Jumping right into that Senate primary, where there's a dead heat between the two Democratic frontrunners, Angela Alsobrooks, the Prince George's County executive, shot up a whopping 25 points in just the last 2 months, just edging out David Trone, the congressman from Western Maryland. What's behind Alsobrooks' rise in popularity, and what are you hearing from voters?
Yeah, so we've seen a significant rise for Alsobrooks here compared to our previous poll. And we see that this is driven largely by African-American voters. She's at 60%. It's about 2 to 1 compared to Trone. And then we also see that voters under the age of 30 are backing her by a significant margin. And then finally, we see a swell of support among women, some of whom were undecided in our previous poll, but who are now showing up for Alsobrooks. This is a really good sign for her on Election Day, since a majority of Democratic primary voters here are likely to be women. I think the one caveat is that Trone does post a small lead in the early vote. So Alsobrooks will be dependent on a good showing on Election Day, but this is definitely not over, and this is definitely good news for the Alsobrooks campaign.
Whomever wins the Democratic primary will face presumptive Republican nominee for that Senate seat, former Governor Larry Hogan. Hogan has been very popular in the state, with about 2/3 viewing him favorably and only about half viewing Trone and Alsobrooks favorably. Do Republicans have a chance of flipping this seat?
Well, I think if the election were held today, the numbers look very good for the Democrats. Both Trone and Alsobrooks have wide appeal across gender, age, and ethnicity. So, it's hard to say that this is really that competitive. But I can say, if it were held today, I think the Democrats would pull ahead. I think what Hogan does have going for him is that he leads among independents by a 10 to 20 point margin, which is a real boost for his campaign. And as you said, he boasts high favorability numbers, extremely high name ID, but he's unlikely to win on these margins alone. So he'll have to win a bulk of those independents along with some Democratic defectors. And that's just going to be a tough ask in this electoral environment.
President Biden is polling with double-digit margins in this state. In a three-way race, the president has 17 points on former President Trump. But as we said, Hogan, a Republican, is quite popular in that state. Are there issues that Hogan is addressing right now that are resonating with voters? What's the reason for this split support?
And when I think we look at the numbers, we see that Hogan is winning more so among folks who say that the economy, which includes jobs, inflation, and taxes, are among their top priorities. That's not true of Donald Trump in Maryland. He splits the vote with Joe Biden. And so I think some of these folks who know Hogan, they're more willing to go with a known commodity who may happen to be a Republican in this case in a highly Democratic state. So I think that might be a reason that we're seeing some of the split ticket. Abortion is also going to be on the ballot. We know that Hogan is a little bit more moderate. And so we can see in those numbers that he doesn't have as many defectors away from him on that abortion number among those folks who say that abortion is their top priority. So, I think that those issues, those are some top issues in the state. That's definitely driving a bit of that discrepancy that we're seeing between Trump and Hogan. And then finally, we see that 16% of Republicans in Maryland are supporting Biden. Whereas on the other hand, with Hogan, he's actually pulling up to 20% of Democrats in our crosstabs. So there's clearly a bit of a more moderate streak. Some of these folks who are independent, lean moderate, slightly left of center maybe, they're going for Hogan, but Trump can't really claim that in Maryland.
Maryland, certainly an interesting state to watch. Matt Taglia, Senior Director of Emerson College Polling, thanks for breaking down those numbers for us.
Thank you.
That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Margaret Chadbourn. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.